Okay, let's get across the Atlantic to European Eurasia and environs. The triple E, I just made that up. Now, just as I was suggesting in Latin America, that they have been for decades moving further and further to the left, center left to further left, and now they're starting to perhaps pull back towards center left, and maybe even some are going over to center right. In European Eurasia, as a general rule, most of the countries have bordered between center left and center right, with the predominance of them being center left. But there's a very rapid move over to center right all over this region. And in some cases, they're going further and further and further to the right in specific countries here and there. So when I'm talking about European, Eurasian, and environs, I'm speaking of kind of classic Europe, whether you call it Western Europe or Eastern Europe, Northern Europe or Mediterranean Europe. But also I'm going to throw in the Russians and the Turks into this fray, because those are places that are actually specifically going further and further right. Now let's start with the classic Europeans, and then we'll move out to the periphery to look at the peoples of note in charge in this place. Now, we'll start with one you should know, but you probably don't because she's so new. Who is this lady? Her name is Theresa May, and she's the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. Prime Minister Theresa May. She is also the leader of the Conservative Party. I wonder what her political affiliation would be then. Well, if it's the Conservative Party, that's right, she is center-right conservative. And the Conservative Party you may also hear called the Tories in Great Britain. It is the equivalent of, say, the Republican Party here in the United States. She just took office in July of 2016. So I really don't have a lot to say about her. She's only been there a couple of months and hasn't done anything yet. She actually had to take over because the previous prime minister quit. What? Why? Hang on to that thought for just a second. Since she hasn't really done enough to talk about, let's talk about the UK and prime ministers for a second. The reason you should always know the leader of the United Kingdom is because they are a gigantically huge U.S. ally. And they pretty much have been since we kicked them out of the 13 original colonies. Okay, not so much at the beginning, but the last 100 years, the U.S. and the UK have had what we call a special relationship. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. And what that refers to is that these two countries really support each other on the world stage in really all ways two countries can support each other. They are really tight allies, militarily, politically, diplomatically. They support each other in really all aspects of country living. I'm telling you that because I just told you that Prime Minister Theresa May is conservative, center-right conservative, and Barack Obama is center-left liberal in the United States. So these two leaders don't like each other? No, it doesn't matter. When it comes to these two states, they have this relationship that's so tight, it really doesn't matter who's in charge. Who's in charge is of no consequence, quite frankly. The relationship between the states supersedes any political differences that the two leaders of each of those states might have with each other. Does that make sense? Okay. So as a center-right conservative in the United Kingdom, Theresa May and her party kind of have all the same, if not very similar, positions that the Republicans do in the United States about being socially conservative, about fiscally conservative, strong military, pro-police, yada, 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 fill in the blanks. Now, I said she is a prime minister. We should stop and talk about that for a minute. What does that mean? What is a prime minister? Well, what other prime ministers have we talked about thus far? It's only been one. Do you remember who other person is a prime minister? Prime Minister Justin Trudeau of, that's right, Canada. You remember handsome Justin, right? So all the other leaders we talked about in the Americas are all presidents. So what's the main difference, or what is the difference between a prime minister and a president? In most circumstances, prime ministers, wherever you see them, are the true head of state. In terms of power and leadership, they are the equivalent of a president. In most, but not all, okay? But that's not even what separates them mainly. What separates the presidents from prime ministers is that when you hear the term president as the leader of a country, that is someone that is directly elected. Meaning the people of that country go out in an election, and here we are in an election year 2016 in the United States, and the people of the United States are going to go out, and they have two choices in front of them, two humans, two named people, and they're going to choose between person X and person Y, right? Now, and whoever gets the most votes is the president. Now, I know we got this electoral college thing in America that throws a monkey wrench into stuff, but everywhere else, people directly elect their president. Prime ministers are not directly elected. Prime ministers are first and foremost the head of their political party. Again, Theresa May is the head of the Conservative Party. And as the head of the party, they get into power, they become the prime minister when their party controls the parliament. And think of the parliament, parliaments anywhere, similar to Congress. So Congress got the Senate and the House of Representatives. You have these elected officials from around the country that go to Congress and pass laws and do stuff, or in the case of the United States, do nothing. However, right now in the United States, you have the Republicans that control the House of Representatives, and don't the Republicans control the Senate as well? So they have more than 50% of the people that are sitting in those chairs in Congress are Republicans. Let's say it's 52%. Well, in the United Kingdom, if the Republicans had 52% control of the parliament, they would just pick who they wanted as president. The people don't pick. The political party in charge picks. It's a little trickier in places that have more than two political parties, though, okay? More on that in just a second. But in most cases, to reinforce this, when you see the prime minister, if you see on world news about any country and they're featuring a prime minister, that usually means that the prime minister is the actual head of the government. Again, like a president. Has the real power. Heads the executive branch. Can make command decisions on terms of tax policy or war, starting a war or ending a war. The real power, okay? Although in many countries that have a prime minister, you may also see a different person, whether it's a monarch, a king or queen, or someone called a president or a governor general, is the head of state. And I know that gets kind of confusing. It's like, wait, I thought you just said the prime minister is the head of state. Yes, the prime minister is the actual head of the government, has functional power and does stuff. But you might, again, have a largely ceremonial figurehead position called the king or queen or a president that is the technical head of state that just sits around and looks pretty, okay? So most countries that have a prime minister have some other entity that's pretending to be the head of state, but they don't have the real power, okay? Now, that's tricky enough of itself. Here's what's also a little tricky. In most places, they're actually the head while the president, so named, is secondary, but not always. And I'll just choose a couple here. Russia has a prime minister and a president. The president is the person really in charge, not the prime minister, okay? More tricky than that is that prime ministers often have to, what we call, form a government or form a coalition government. And what that means is that more often than not, a country has more than two political parties. I know the U.S. is, we all grew up here and this is what we're used to, so we just assume this is the way it is everywhere else. Wrong! Having only two political parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, is actually kind of odd. It's kind of weird. Most other places on the planet have more than two political parties. Yeah, I know. There's the Libertarians that get like 0.5% every election in the U.S., but two main political parties in the United States. Well, that would make it easy if we had a prime minister situation, because whoever got the most votes, whoever got more than 50% of the votes, that's it. They're in control. That's not the way it works everywhere else, though, because in many countries you have 3 or 4 or 5 or 10 political parties. So what happens when the United Kingdom goes to vote, call a general election, and they're going to vote for their congresspeople, they call them MPs, okay, or the senators, and whoever then ends up getting the majority of parliament, again, would get to pick whoever the prime minister is. Whatever political party has the majority gets to pick who's in charge. But if you have 3 or 4 or 5 political parties, you may not have a single political party that gets 51%. In fact, it's kind of rare. So they have to do what's called forming a government. So let's pretend that the Conservative Party in Great Britain gets like 40% of the vote. And the Liberal Party in Great Britain in the same election gets like 35% of the vote. well, the Conservative Party has more people, but they don't have a majority. So there's 25% of somebody else, of other representatives, that the then Conservative Party would say, well, we got the most votes, but not a majority. So let's go work with another political party. Now let's make up one. Actually, it's a real one called the Greens. Let's pretend the Greens had the other 20%, okay, or other 25%. So the Conservative Party would then go to the Greens and say, hey, can you want to form a government with us? And what that means is, well, individually, neither of our political parties has the majority. However, let's work together, and working together, we now have a majority of 65% of the seats. And why would the Greens want to work with the Conservatives? Well, because the Conservatives will say, hey, look, you support most of the stuff that we want. You support most of the laws and measures we're going to try to pass, and then we'll work in some of yours. We'll support some of yours. Otherwise, you have no voice at all. So it behooves a minority party like the Greens to say, okay, well, if we don't form the government with the Conservatives, we won't have much of a voice. So yeah, we'll work with you. Okay, we'll do it. We'll form a government, and if it's more than one political party working together, it's called a coalition government. Now, why am I going into great detail to explain these things to you? I know, you're bored beyond belief. But a lot of students ask me a lot. This question comes up a lot in the 20 years I've been doing this. People will send me a news story and say, oh my gosh, Professor, what just happened? The Netherlands government collapsed. And does that mean the Netherlands is like going to fall into a black hole and be sucked into a gravitational vortex of destruction? They have no government. It's a chaos. Is it like a zombie apocalypse? No. What that means is that the Netherlands has a parliament, okay, and that whoever was in charge had formed a coalition government. And at some point, one of the political parties involved in the coalition got pissed off and said, you know what, we don't agree with what you're doing. We don't like the direction that you're taking the country. We are undissolving this coalition. We're out. And because we're pulling ourselves out, you no longer have a majority, whoever that was, whatever political party put up the prime minister. You no longer have a majority, and so government out. Okay? It's not so much a collapse as a dissolution. And so what has to happen in that situation is they call for another election. They're like, okay, well, the political party that has the most votes can try to reform a coalition government with other political parties, but if they can't do that, then they have to say, okay, new election, let's have an election, everybody vote again, and then we'll try to form a coalition government again if we don't have an outright majority. Does that make sense? By the way, there's a whole bunch of places in Europe that haven't had a government per se for a while because the political parties can't seem to form a coalition. I think the Netherlands is one of them that's just like, we really don't have a working government right now because not enough parties can agree to put up a prime minister. and somehow the world keeps on going without one. Spain's another place that people are so bitterly divided between several political parties that they can't decide on a working government to keep it going. Anyway, I'm now waxing too poetic about prime ministerships. I just want to end on this about prime ministers. It is, I think, probably the majority of democracies on planet Earth have this parliamentary prime minister system. I know you think, well, they're the same as presidential democracies that have presidents in terms of believing in democracy, but I think if you started counting all the places that had a prime minister as the head of state, head of the government, instead of a president, there's probably more of them than there are of the presidential system. Just saying. Don't take me to the bank on that one. Go count them up yourself. But I'd wager some money that that's the case. It's a pretty popular system. And where else do you see prime ministers as the true power of the state? Almost all the European countries. You just kind of go around all of Europe from Scandinavia down to the Mediterranean, east to west, and most of them have somebody called a prime minister in charge. If you see the word prime minister so-and-so from a European country, assume they're the head cheese. With one exception, France. France always got to be the exception. So France has a semi-presidential, semi-parliamentary system where they have a parliament and all that stuff, but they do a popular election for the president. Okay? Where else around the world do you see prime minister situations? many former European colonies, and specifically old British colonies, pretty much if Britain controlled you at some point in the past, you have adopted a prime minister type of government. So, and you can see these all around the world. To Canada, we already said Canada has a prime minister, but India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, all that used to be British territory, Australia, New Zealand, Iraq, a couple other places in the Middle East, Bahrain over in Southeast Asia, Tanzania, probably 2 or 3 or 4 other African countries, even places in the Caribbean like Jamaica have prime ministers in charge. Now, there are some non-British influenced prime ministers in charge in other parts of the planet. 2 that I definitely want you to know are Japan and Israel. I guess Israel was influenced by the British some, but that's a different story. But Japan, they have a prime minister, not a president, okay? Again, the main point is they are not popularly elected. It's who's ever in control of the parliament, or the diet in the case of Japan. Places that have a prime minister, but it's not the actual head of government, are France, as I pointed out. They have a prime minister, but it's kind of in France, the prime minister is like the head of all ministers. You're minister prime. You're in charge of the cabinet or something. I don't know the specifics, but yeah, some places have a prime minister that's just a really important person in the government. France is one of them. Turkey is one of them. Russia has a prime minister, as I pointed out, that is not the top slot. And places like Iran and some other parts of planet Earth have prime ministers, but they're not the top slot, okay? And it's not hard to figure out which is which. The people featured on TV and in news stories and at the UN, they're prime ministers. They're the head cheeses. But let's bring it back to May. Bring it back to the UK. Give me some fish and chips at the pub. What's up with this Theresa May? As I suggested, she's only been in office for a few months. Depends on when you're watching this. But she's been in office since July of 2016. She took over from one David Cameron. He's the ex-Prime Minister of the UK, centre-right Conservative, used to be the head of the Conservative Party. What happened? He quit! He quit because of this little thing that I'll bet you heard about in the news called the Brexit vote. There you go. I bet you heard of it. And David Cameron, again, same political party as May, was Prime Minister. He said, when he got into office years ago, he said, we should have a referendum on whether Great Britain should leave the European Union. He himself did not want to leave the European Union. He thought for sure that most Britons would not want to leave the European Union. But it was his fault that the vote happened. He said, no, we're going to hold a referendum. We're going to let the British people decide. And decide they did in summer of 2016. And they voted to leave the European Union. And David Cameron, former Prime Minister David Cameron, was campaigning for that not to happen. And he said, the day of the vote, he went on national TV and said, well, I tried. And this referendum only happened because of me. I don't believe that Great Britain should leave the European Union, but Great Britain is going to leave the European Union, so I'm out. Thanks for the memories. Chip, chip, and cheerio. I quit. So that's how Theresa May came to be in charge. There was no popular vote. Again, it's a prime ministership. There was no vote at all. The political party, the Conservative political party, the Tory party, was an internal affair. And they're like, oh, crap. Okay, Cameron just quit, so which one of us is going to take his place? And Theresa May was the cream that rose to the top. But enough about prime ministers. Enough about the United Kingdom and its special relationship with the United States and its Brexit debacle. Let's move on to the rest of Europe. And let's have a fun quiz here that maybe you'll know the answer to. Which one of these people was not born in Germany? Is it one of these lovely ladies here, or is it, who is that? Oh, it's Albert Einstein. Oh, that's Adolf Hitler. I know that dude. Oh, who's that? That's Augustus Gloop. What? Which one of these people is not German? Well, Augustus Gloop, if you don't know who that is a child actor that starred in Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, which just sprung into my mind since Gene Wilder passed away just last week. He played Willy Wonka, by the way. Albert Einstein, yeah, he's German, right? The other one's a supermodel, Claudia Schiffer. And the last person that maybe you don't know yet is actually Chancellor Angela Merkel, who is also German. So the answer is actually Hitler, but who cares? Hitler's dead, inappropriately so. What we want to learn about is Chancellor Angela Merkel. And I know it looks like Angela. That would be the American pronunciation, but it's Angela. And Chancellor, what is that? Chancellor is another word for Prime Minister. Bam, you got it. So as I suggested, most European countries are prime ministerships, and Germany's one of them. They just have a cool word for it. So Chancellor Angela Merkel is the leader of Germany, and much more than that, she is definitely the most powerful woman in the world. You know, I throw out a lot of explicatives like this, where it's the best and the biggest and the wildest, but I do it being genuine. She actually is the most powerful woman in the world, voted that way by Forbes magazine and Time magazine and pretty much any assessment organization anywhere, because of many things. The main one being that Germany, the Germans, are an economic juggernaut. The Germans are an economic juggernaut, and Angela is leading that economic juggernaut, meaning that Germany is currently the fourth biggest economy on planet Earth, a position it will likely hold for the rest of our lives. Many other European countries used to be top 10 or top 20 biggest economies on planet Earth for a very long time. They're all slowly sliding down the rankings and leaving the top 10. Germany is going nowhere. They're that rich, they're that important, they're that big a deal in the world, but specifically in Europe. And this woman has led the helm of this biggest economy of Europe for, I don't even know, years, maybe going on a decade. Now, she is center-right conservative, especially fiscally. Woo! Economically and fiscally, she is the queen of conservatism in Europe. Socially, though, a bit more liberal, and you should probably understand that about all of Europe, that we think of Democrats versus Republicans in the United States, and the Republicans are socially very conservative, as well as perhaps fiscally conservative. That's not so much the case in Europe. In Europe, if you're on the conservative side, it's mostly referring to your fiscal policy. Most Europeans, no matter where you are, socially are a bit more liberal, okay? So when I say center-right conservative, I'm thinking mostly of the fiscal economic aspect of this. But as the leader of the fourth largest economy on planet Earth, the biggest economy in Europe itself, Germany has kind of a special status. And a lot of my European friends will not like to hear this spoken out loud, but I'm just going to say it. Germany really is the most powerful player within the European Union, especially now that Great Britain is leaving, because that was the next biggest economy. Maybe France's economy is a little bit bigger than the UK. I don't know. Both of them are sliding down. Germany's still up there. Germany has special status as the most powerful player in Europe and the European Union because they're so big, because they invest so much in the central banking system of Europe. And a lot of the bank's money in Europe is German money. So they have a lot more power than might be suggested as, oh, well, they're just a European country, a single member of the European Union. No. Nine. Much more powerful than that. They kind of make the rules. And as the leader of the country that kind of makes the rules, she makes the rules. And I'll be more specific. If Germany does not want some legislation passed through the European Union, it's not going to get passed. If Germany does not like some sort of fiscal package that the EU countries are pushing, it's not going to get through. If Germany says, here's what's going to happen for the European banks to lend money to Italy or Greece or Ireland, that's what's going to happen. Now, France has a big voice in this too, but again, France is in a bit of economic trouble. Germany is still a powerhouse, and they control quite a bit. I'm telling you this specifically because Europe has been in the grips of a recession since 2008, a fairly nasty one they haven't quite gotten out of yet. You can argue if the U.S. has gotten out of it, but it's hitting Europe way harder, and it appears it's going to last way longer. And Germany has said, For years now, Angela Merkel personally has said, Chancellor Merkel has personally said, hey, the way that we're going to get out of this mess is to be more fiscally responsible. That's a conservative thing. And if we're going to lend money to anybody, if the central bank's going to lend money to anybody, if our banks are going to lend money to anybody, then we're going to demand you be more fiscally austere, that you have austerity measures put into place. What's that mean? Well, that means you have to balance your budget. You have to spend less on public stuff. I don't know, like highways and healthcare and education. You have to balance your budget internally and show that you're being fiscally responsible before we're going to lend you penny one or farthing one or Deutschmark one. Well, they're all euro one now. So that's been Angela Merkel's main theme. And as a exceptionally powerful player within Europe, most powerful woman in the world, that's exactly what the European Union has been doing. Much to the chagrin of all of the countries that have been going broke and don't like the idea that Germany gets to set the rules that they then have to play by. And I'll bring up some specific ones because we should branch out and look at other parts of Europe to some other, let's call them more minor players. Austerity measures put in place by the Germans for who? Well, the UK has been pinching its pounds because they've been pulling themselves out of the recession too. But the Greeks have been full-on bankrupt. And I know you've heard this. There's a lot of animosity between the Greeks and the Germans because the Greeks are like, what? We're going bankrupt. We need money. Bail us out. And the Germans have said, yeah, sure, as long as you cut your government budget in half. And the Greeks are like, what? But we're already going bankrupt. That's going to cause more people to go poor. Germany's like, we don't care. So this is kind of the tension that's been playing out within the EU over fiscal policy. And Greece is not alone. Many other countries, and I'm going to call them the Mediterranean amigos, have been in this boat, a sinking boat, in terms of their economies being sluggish, if not going negative. And I say the Mediterranean amigos because this should be material for a future lecture, but if you look at Europe from a distance, you'll notice that the northern part of Europe is where the super rich states are. And you can look at Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg, Denmark, Scandinavian countries, Norway, Sweden, Germany, even Poland, UK. That's where the money is, up north. A lot of money up north. The poorer countries are down south, and the further south you go, the kind of not so rich they are. I shouldn't even say poorer. That's a relative term because Spain and Italy and Greece are rich compared to many African or Southeast Asian countries. But they certainly aren't as rich as Northern Europe. So there is a real wealth divide that's opening up in Europe between the North and the South. The Germans, of course, up north say, hey, here's the policies we're going to have because we're rich and we can do them. But you're going to be forced to do them down south as well where you perhaps can't afford it. So who are the Mediterranean amigos I'm speaking of? Well, here's some new faces for you to know. Other Euro economies that are also in trouble besides Greece are Spain. And this guy is Mariano Rajoy, Prime Minister of Spain. He's been in office for, I don't know, one term, but I already referenced that they haven't even been able to form a working coalition government, I don't know, for years, if not decades, maybe since World War II. Spain is in trouble on multiple fronts. Their economy is but one of their issues/ills. Mariano Rajoy is conservative center-right. So he has been in charge of Spain, kind of saying, yes, we need to adopt these fiscal policies that the northern states want us to do in order to get money lent to us to try to get out of this mess. It's not been working. Other folks that I want you to know of are Prime Minister Matteo Renzi of Italy. Matteo Renzi, actually the youngest person to become Prime Minister of Italy since Mussolini. I don't know if he really wants that distinction, but as a younger guy, and charismatic as well, he's actually center-left. And he's been pushing back against these austerity measures, saying, hey, look, man, mamma mia, we got to spend the money to make money. That's not the way Matteo Renzi actually speaks. But he's saying, look, yes, Italy is a financial disaster basket case as well. But we can't cut government spending too much because then we won't have growth, people won't have jobs, and it's a self-perpetuating negative cycle. So he got into power precisely because Italians were saying, hey, we don't want to do that austerity measure stuff. We're going to put in a center-left guy. And by the way, Renzi has been one of many prime ministers of Italy in the last few years. They're cycling through people fast. Surprise, surprise! How right I was to say that last year. Prime Minister Renzi quit in December of 2016 after being foiled at the polls in a referendum that he was pushing. In classic Italian style, he was pushing a referendum to try to get their economic house in order. And he said, well, you know, everybody wants this, and we want to be a better society, so everybody support this referendum to make our country better. And the Italians said, oh, mamma mia, we don't think so. So he was like, okay, I quit. So now the Italian stallion in charge is one Prime Minister Paolo Gentiloni Silveri. But honestly, I don't really care if you memorize his name and face. I'm not going to ask you about him because I don't really know much about him because he hasn't been in office that long and he hasn't done that much and he probably won't last in office much longer either. The Italians continue to change leaders faster than they change their linens. Mamma mia, it's just such a messy meatball of Italian politics, as usual. As has their next door neighbor, Greece. And this is Prime Minister Alexis Tsipras of Greece. Tsipras? I'm not sure you pronounce that. The Greek terms are so hard, the Greek pronunciation. But Prime Minister Alexis Tsipras of Greece, he is also the youngest person to become Prime Minister of Greece since 1865. And, dig this, he was a Communist Party youth member. And that should tip you off to his political affiliations. That's right, he is the leader of the leftist party, Syriza. So not even just center-left. Renzi of Italy is just center-left, saying, hey, we need to have a bit more liberal fiscal policy. Tsipras is even further left than that, and he got elected as a direct result of the power of Angela Merkel to kind of push austerity onto the Greeks. And the Greek economy has just been floundering for years. They're completely bankrupt. They're so in debt they could never pay back the loans, much less try to borrow enough money to pay back the loans and to keep the government going. So the election of a further left prime minister is a direct result. It's an anti-EU and anti-Germany and anti-austerity measures kind of situation of, no, we're tired of doing that. We've tried to save money. We've tried to tighten our belts, and it's gotten us nowhere. Our economy's getting worse. Let's put in somebody who openly rejects that. And that's what Tsipras has done and said, hey, look, man, you guys got to forgive some of this debt. This is crazy. We're not going to pay back this money. We need to rework the debt. We're not going to keep doing it. So the southern economies down in the Mediterranean, led by one center-right conservative, two center-left liberal guys, all three states are in financial trouble, Greeks being in the biggest financial trouble, Italy and Spain, and not as much, but going nowhere fast. And all three states have immigration issues as well. And it's another reason they would say, hey, look, you can't make us be austere and cut back government's spending. We're also here on the southern front of Europe dealing with all these immigrants coming in from North Africa and the Middle East and even sub-Saharan Africa. Historically, the route to Europe, into Europe, goes through the southern countries, namely Spain, Italy, and Greece. And if you follow the news at all in the last, 5 years, you've seen that there's been a huge inflow of immigrants from Syria since the civil war broke out there, and from Libya since that country fell into chaos during the Arab Spring. So you've had, as those southern states have become broke in a recession, it's the same time that more and more hundreds of thousands of people are trying to get into Europe going through those very states. The immigration issue is actually a hot button issue for all of Europe, Germany included. In fact, I brought this back up intentionally for you to understand that German Chancellor Angela Merkel is pretty popular. She's been in office a long time. Very popular, actually. But even her popularity has taken a significant hit since the Syrian civil wars broke out and mass exodus of people from North Africa and Syria have headed into Europe, because she said, hey, look, we're the rich states. Yes, it's our responsibility as Europeans to open the borders and let people in and help out as much as we can. Yeah, but then you have this ISIS group that's now bombing stuff all over France, and maybe some of them have snuck in with these immigrants. And remember, all these countries are in a recession, so they're kind of broke. And they're like, how are we supposed to pull in all of these hundreds of thousands of new people? Our economy's not doing well on its own. Our people aren't doing well. So this has become a divisive issue within the European Union. It's one of the reasons why Britain voted to leave. Yeah, it's that important. It's kind of a big deal. So Germany's Angela Merkel is super popular still, I think. She still has pretty good approval ratings. But she has definitely slipped a bit in Germany and perhaps not looked as favorably upon in other parts of Europe because of her more open door policy towards these immigrants that has honestly even overwhelmed certain countries in Europe, Germany included. So think about geography. All those immigrants coming in from the south, yeah, they come through the Mediterranean countries. Most of those immigrants want to go where? To the northern European countries, where the money is, where the jobs are, the richer societies. So it has been a divisive issue for Europe, and it's leading many European governments to move further and further to the conservative right. That's right, get more socially conservative. The immigration issue is pushing a lot of voters in many European countries to start to get more conservative and pull further to the right. Hey, that's an issue in the American election too, right? Right? It's way more important in Europe. Anyway, let's round out the rest of our European leaders. Let's get to one who's not over on the conservative right, although he soon will be replaced by somebody on the conservative right. Who is this dude? I'll give you a hint. I'll give you a quick hint. He's the most likely to surrender. I surrender! 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 Throw up the white flag! That's right. That is the president of France. His name is Francois Hollande. President Hollande. And he might actually talk like that for all I know. Anyway, President Hollande of France. And a 2017 update that we will come back to. France has a new president, President Macron. But dig the details of the previous president first. He kind of bucks the trend. He's center-left. Well, I shouldn't say bucks the trend, because so we have a center-right in the United Kingdom, Theresa May, Chancellor Angela Merkel, center-right, in Germany, Prime Minister Rajoy in Spain, center-right. And you're starting to see center-right folks pop up in leadership positions all over Europe, but you do have the center-left in Italy, Enrico, and you have center-left Cyprus in Greece now. Francois Hollande is definitely center-left. France is historically kind of a center-left, more liberal society, especially socially. But President Hollande came in kind of also as an anti-austerity guy, and he wasn't as bad as, say, Greece or Italy. France's economy wasn't as bad as Greece's by any stretch of the imagination. But because of the austerity measures, France is actually kind of historically known as having a lot of social benefits, being very liberal in those categories and saying, no, we have a welfare state and free health care and all this other stuff, so he got voted in as an anti-austerity thing, but man, he has taken a hit. When he came into office, he said, oh yeah, well, I'm going to fix the French economy by taxing the rich, and then a lot of rich people left. And we're going to tax corporations more, and then some corporations said, well, we're not going to, and we're going to leave too. And the French economy's kind of just sunk, and really, France has just taken hit after hit after hit since Francois took office. And it's not even really his fault. He's just in the wrong place at the wrong time. He's had a bad go of things in the last few years. So, yeah, France's economy also in recession. And it's a top 10 world economy, but it's been in recession and not doing well. And it hasn't gotten any better since he took over. And they do have very liberal societal benefits. So the state is overspending and the economy is not rebounding as quickly as it should. So they're kind of getting broker. Not emergency broke, but they're getting broker and unemployment's going up. It's a hard place to be to say, hey, we want to be a liberal state that gives lots of stuff away, but we don't have as much money as every year goes by, okay? What's happened during his tenure that's even worse, of course, is France's kind of bizarre duality about immigration. Back to the immigration issue. France historically has been very liberal about allowing people to come in. They are perhaps the most liberal society on planet Earth. And they would pride themselves on this. Even the conservatives would say, yeah, it's liberal France. So, socially we're liberal. equal rights, women's rights, minority rights. We welcome immigrants. Freedom of everything. However, and by the way, especially they're very open to immigrants from places that used to be their colonies. So if you used to be a French colony in North Africa, they would say, oh yeah, well, you used to be a part of France, so you can come to France. But I said they have this duality. So they're pretty liberal about letting folks come in, but most of the immigrants that come to France have a really hard time. They don't get integrated into society. So France kind of pretends, and I'm going to upset some French people here, but whatever, your cheese upsets me. The French say on paper, we're very open and liberal. Come on in. But the reality is that the folks that come into French society really aren't incorporated or integrated into society. And what you have over, the decades, over the generations, is some people come in from Algeria, let's say, or Tunisia, or Turkey. And they come to France with the hope of, oh, well, we're going to be a French citizen. But they're almost a second-class citizens. And you can see where they're at because the ghettos around Paris and other major French cities are filled with people who obviously aren't French or French-born. Now, some of them, like I said, maybe from Algeria, they weren't French-born, but even their kids and their kids' kids are somehow almost segregated from society. And it's not intentional. I'm not saying that they have an intentional segregated society like Jim Crow laws of America. It's just the way that it's panned out, which is why you have endemic poverty within migrants, even second and third generation migrant families and communities, and separate kind of ghettos, and they just don't have as much ability to go up the social ladder in France. That in part, just in part, has fueled the next big thing that you've heard about in France, which is the horrific amount of terrorist attacks that have occurred just in the last few years, really accelerating in the last year, and that's mostly been because of this ISIS group. So I'm just going to point out the most deadliest just in the last couple years. January 2015, you had the Charlie Hebdo office attack by Islamic extremists who, again, attacking liberal France, attacking a free press area, a newspaper that had printed cartoons about the Prophet Muhammad. And so they were attacked quite intentionally, and dozens of people killed. November 2015, you probably heard about the concert attacks. A heavy metal death band was playing in Paris, and people came in with machine guns. And it was a coordinated attack in different parts of the city at the same time, where 100 or 200 died. And just recently, just last summer, in July of 2016, the Nice attacks, where an Islamic extremist got into a truck and just ran over a couple hundred people down on the boardwalk. So why am I telling you all these horrific things? Do you really want to be reminded of them? I don't, quite frankly, but we have to keep in mind that all of this in concert, the bad economic situation that people feel is being worsened by the center-left economic policy, the rise in terrorist attacks, the problems with immigrant issues, both within France but also within greater Europe, all of this is coming together to see a real rise in more popularity of center-right and far-right political groups in France, something they historically have not had. A significant rise in support of further and further right-wing parties. This plays out in Francois Hollande's approval ratings, which are probably the lowest ever in the French Republic's history. Meaning that I think he only has 10%. Most polls indicate 10 or 15% approval ratings. And it could be more into single digits before he's out of office. He actually could run for another term in office, but everybody knows he won't because he wouldn't even have a chance of making it through the primaries to get up to the presidential election. He's that unpopular right now. Who is popular? I mean, single digit approval ratings? Wow. I mean, that was impossible to find, but France has pulled it off. Francois Hollande has pulled it off. Who is more popular? The parties that are espousing anti-immigrant, maybe even anti-EU sentiment are on the rise. The center-right Conservative Party is, I'd say, without a doubt, going to win the next presidential election in France. And it could be that even a further right party makes major inroads and has a whole lot of representation in the French Parliament. You're seeing what's happening in France is reflective of Europe as a whole. All of these issues that are pushing people to be more and more and more conservative and be more and more maybe anti-immigrant, maybe even anti-EU collective immigrant policy. Well, I called that election. The French did indeed swing from the liberal left to the conservative right in their last election that was held in May of 2017. And they did elect one President Macron, which was kind of a big deal, not because he's done anything yet, but because this election was watched by the world, and definitely by the Europeans, because it was feared that not just a conservative right party was going to win in France, but a radical right-wing party was going to end up taking over. And people were afraid of this because of the populist election of Donald Trump in the United States and the kind of populist anti-EU movement that ended up with Brexit in Great Britain and the rise of kind of more radical right-wing anti-immigration parties all across Europe. So the French election was a really big deal, and it had this kind of happy, nice ending in that a normal political party that was just barely center-right, in fact, they identified themselves as centrist, ended up winning and is now in control of the French government. And not just the president, but they had kind of a popular election for the equivalent of their House and Senate, and this political party kind of won all those elections too. So it's a just center-right, centrist political party that is in control of the French government. Now, back to a few things about Macron himself. At the age of 39, he is France's youngest president ever. Just a little trivia. Good-looking fella, too, right? He came into power by founding this centrist party that I referenced already, a political party named En Marche. En Marche, translation, forward, onward, working, on the move. But it hasn't really lived up to its name just as yet. It hasn't got a whole lot of stuff done since this guy took office over the summer. It kind of is called a centrist party because they were trying to pull support from both sides of the political aisle, and they succeeded in doing that in the election. So they're trying to also pull policy objectives from both the right and left side of the political spectrum. And they define themselves as a centrist liberal party because they're socially liberal, as most people in democracies are. But the conservative elements it's trying to pull into its platform really follow kind of conservative economic and fiscal policy. And if you don't know anything about France, its economic and fiscal policy has sucked for decades. And it hasn't been that competitive. It's a big kind of world economy in the top 10, but it's been slipping year after year after year. And it's been kind of getting broker year after year after year. So everybody knows it's got to get fixed. Everybody thinks they want to get it fixed, but they've not been able to put anybody in power who can fix it. And Macron is their new hope that, yes, he's going to get some things changed. In his kind of more fiscally conservative ideological bent, they do favor free market economics, cutting taxes, reducing public financing. And France gives away a lot of public benefits. So this has already become a sticking point. So he was elected to change things and make France better. And so for 6 months, he's tried to modernize the French workforce by maybe not having a 30-hour work week and maybe getting closer to a 40-hour work week. Cutting taxes on the rich, which kind of pisses off some more liberal leftist type people. Wants to pull back on some social benefits because they can't afford to keep giving out all the social benefits. And that has met with fierce resistance from the people of France, even the ones who maybe voted to get him in there. So he's kind of stuck. He is currently, I won't say he's unpopular yet, but when he was elected, it was like 66 or 67% of the vote. Within a couple months, his support was already down to 55%. A couple months after that, it's down to 45%. So they haven't really achieved a whole lot yet, and the confidence levels are slipping fast, although he still isn't anywhere near as reviled as former President Hollande, so he's got a ways to sink before he gets to that level. But the hope is that he can help pull things together for France. He just hasn't quite gotten there yet, but we'll keep an eye on France's youngest president ever, Macron. Got it? Okay. Before we get out of Europe and head around to some periphery, I did want you to know one more term, and that's the EU3. The EU3 is a little acronym that I made up. Well, I don't know if I made it up. You can see it in other places. And that refers to the three most powerful, important leaders of Europe, which we've now covered. And I pulled in a few others, too, to explain what's happening across Europe economically. And that is the EU3, the big three, are the leaders of the UK, of Germany, and of France. The three biggest economies in Europe. Maybe even the three biggest populations, but that's a secondary concern. The three most important power players. And when you see these three together, you'll often see them on the sidelines of European Union meetings. You'll see them actually meet with the President of the United States. Oh, look, here's a delightful picture of Barack Obama meeting with the EU3, although the one guy from Great Britain, that's David Cameron. He's now since quit, so I don't have a recent picture with Theresa May as part of the EU3. But these three, a president, a chancellor, and a prime minister, they do collectively pull most of the weight in the European Union. Even after Great Britain leaves, they're the three biggest power players economically and politically in Europe. And so you'll often see them pony up and meet on the sidelines to discuss major things to work together on before they then go to the European Union or a greater collective, even at the United Nations, to chat about stuff. Does that make sense? So the UK and the US have a special relationship, and they often meet more than other world leaders do. But if it's going to be a Europe/United States affair talking about policy, it'll be the US president and the EU3. Know those folks. General rule to be thinking about here, Europe is starting to move significantly towards the right politically. But let's now go to the periphery. Let's press on further into the continent to look for systems that are going even further to the right, even more conservative and even further to the right. And I'll now pick on Mother Russia. I'll bet you know this dude. Who is this dude? What was his former occupation? And why is he a living legend? Did I really say all that about Vladimir Putin? I'm going to try to keep this brief, but of course I'm not going to be able to because I never keep anything brief. But I wax poetic about Putin perhaps a little too much. And anybody that's taken my class in the last decade or two knows that I've been following this guy for about a decade or two. Have watched him come from obscurity, rise to power in Russia, and now rise to power on planet Earth. He is a significant human to know, and he is a living legend. Why would I say all of these crazy things about a single human? Well, I asked you what his former profession was. He's had many, and I'm going to go through the litany. I'm going to go through his CV very quickly here. He was former KGB during the Cold War. Yeah, KGB, kind of like CIA/secret police. Probably a spy. It was an operative in Germany for a while, in East Germany, maybe even in West Germany. He knows his way around the spy business. He is a quite dangerous person, perhaps because of his KGB training. I always like to say that he is very likely the only world leader that has killed someone with his bare hands. I say likely. I didn't say I got proof. I said it's likely. I would say that he is the world leader I'd put money on in a bare-knuckled to the death match with all the world leaders all in one cage. Put your money on Putin. He is former KGB. He is a black belt in judo. He is the international man of mystery that knows how to fire every weapon, knows how to pilot every craft. He's been on submarines and hand gliders and in race cars, and he's shot Uzis, and he's wrestled leopards and hunted lions and flown with geese. He's scuba dived in the world's deepest lake. This guy has done it all. He's insane! And he continually promotes his image as the world's manliest man, not just the manliest man in Russia, but the manliest man in the world. He's really become a kind of pop cultural icon onto his own right in the world, and certainly a conservative icon. That's right, I'm already tipping the hat to his political affiliation. He's center-right conservative, maybe further right than that. And he's become the darling of the conservatives worldwide, not just in Russia. Some people even in the United States are like, oh, if we only had a manly man, a strong leader like Putin. I believe Donald Trump is probably playing off of a lot of that. He himself has said he wants to work with Putin, and Putin gave him multiple compliments right back. That's how crazy this Vladimir Putin is. Now, he's a mega man of mega men, and he's done it all. He's also the most popular dude in Russia, with the highest approval rating in country of probably any political leader on planet Earth. I didn't say he was the most popular politician on planet Earth. I told you Barack Obama was that, most readily identified. Vladimir Putin would be a close second to that, but he's also the most popular politician in-house, meaning he's got like an 80% approval rating, maybe 85%, maybe 90%. Like 80% of Russians think that he's like a demigod, the greatest human. He can do no wrong. Anything that's uttered from his lips is fact, and it's true, and it's awesome. Why is that? What? This crazy story I've now whipped up. What the hell am I talking about? Okay, let's fill out the rest of his resume. I said he's former KGB. Was basically handpicked by Boris Yeltsin, the first president of Russia, once it became Russia and the Soviet Union went away. The then president handpicked Putin, who nobody in Russia really knew, and to be the president into the year 2000. So Vladimir Putin became the second president of Russia in 2000, and was in power for 2 terms, 2000 and 2008. And put this in your brain, by the way, that's the same timeline that George Bush was president of the United States. 2 countries went on very divergent paths during this 8-year run. So he then stepped down as president. It was 2 terms, just like the United States, 2 terms up. He stepped down as president, and immediately became prime minister. Okay, but you already told us, Boyer, that prime minister is not as powerful a position in Russia. It is in most places, but not in Russia. That's true. But when Vladimir Putin is prime minister, it's the most important position. So technically, he wasn't in charge, but he was in charge. He allowed a good friend of his, Dmitry Medvedev, to become president for 1 term. And while Dmitry Medvedev was president, they changed the Russian constitution to allow for the terms of the president to be not 4 years, but 6 years. And in doing so, they said, well, Vladimir Putin served 2 4-year terms, so he's now qualified to return to the presidency for 6-year terms. See? He didn't get to do that before, so the 2 he already did don't matter. So he was president from 2000 to 2008, prime minister from 2008 to 2012. They changed the constitution. He became president again in 2012 and will be so till infinity. Actually, not even till infinity. Technically, he can run 2 6-year terms, so he could easily be president till 2024. And he will be, and at some point from now to 2024, they could change the constitution again. He's probably going to be president of Russia for life unless some crazy thing happens, which does happen. Why? Why would a country bend over backwards and glorify great Russian leader Vladimir Putin and allow him to be in office basically for 2 or 3 decades with 80 or 90% approval ratings? And when I say 80 or 90% approval ratings, I'm talking about blind approval ratings. Meaning if Vladimir Putin went on Russian national television tonight and said, by the way, the United States is invading Russia through Belarus, so we must launch a Russian missile. We must blow up all Western Europe. 80% of Russians will be like, yeah! Woo! To victory! I mean, I wish I was exaggerating. I wish I was. But that's the power he has in this society and in this country here at this particular juncture in early 21st century. And it is a unique combination of things that have come together, meaning that he is a leader in a very streamlined political situation, that he can do anything he wants to, and the government will go along with it because the deck is stacked in his favor, and the people will go along with it because they're stacked in his favor as well. So go to the United States. If Barack Obama wants something done, what does he do? Well, he has to send it to Congress, and it gets gridlocked and dies in 6 months. Vladimir Putin tomorrow could say, I'm going to do this, and it's done. And he's very powerful in a very powerful country. That's why I'm saying he kind of is a living legend. Because in the first 8 years he was in office, he really brought Russia's mojo back. Remember, the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. The communist experiment failed, and Russia, as the center of the Soviet Union, lost its international status. It became a nobody. Its economy was broke. They were bankrupt economically and morally. They lost. They were the losers of the Cold War. And for the whole decade of the 90s, they acted like losers. Things stank in Russia, and they didn't get much better even up to the year 2000. When he came into office, he really turned it around for the entire country. They got back on track, mostly because the price of oil got really high, and Russia exports a ton of oil, so they got a ton of money, and he started to fix things and started to fix the economy and started putting money in the bank, in the Russian bank, started to make improvements, has been rebuilding the Russian military ever since. And he has projected power, and that's the most important thing. He has projected Russia as a world power again. That's what's getting their mojo back, and people are now proud to be Russian again. They weren't in the 1990s. They are now, and they see this powerful, manly man leader who presses out against the United States and against Western Europe and says, "Niet, we do not like that. We'll do what we want to do. We'll start our own trade bloc. We'll have our own clubs. We're actually going to invade countries around us and take stuff back. And you're going to do nothing about it, the West." And people are like, oh, we love him. At least the Russians say that, not other countries that get invaded by the Russians. That's what I mean by he got the Russians' mojo back, and he's a living legend. Why is he a living legend? Because I have a man crush on him? Niet, comrade. I'm quite frankly terrified of him, which most people are. I say he's a living legend because he's one of those rare characters that has changed history, has changed 21st century history, and 100, 200, 500 years from now, he will be in the history books as someone who changed world history. And he's got a ways to go yet because of the way that he has streamlined the Russian government and the peoples to basically support anything he wants to do, and what he wants to do, we're not sure about. Living legend. He is already a legend, and he's still alive working. That's what's so important about him. And again, maybe what makes him a little scary. Now, why am I suggesting he's streamlined the government and can do anything he wants? Well, ever since he's been in power and he's had this massive popularity, he's really pushed the government and the society further to the right. His political party was already center-right, if not a further center-right than that, conservative. And they have really consolidated power in the last 16 years now that he's been large and in charge. Even when he was prime minister, behind the scenes, he was in charge. And he has consolidated power. How? Well, by controlling the press. Kind of almost going old school Soviet style, where you kind of intimidate the press that says stuff you don't like and rewards the press that says stuff you do like. It's kind of called propaganda. They have done that effectively for 16 years, so much so that the Russian people, no matter what channel they watch, they're getting the same story, and it's the story the government wants the people to know. I'm not making fun of them, by the way. Please do not mistake this as, Boyer just hates Putin, or Boyer just hates Russia. I've talked to journalist after journalist who says, yeah, Russia's in a really weird place right now. They are just all about whatever their press says is fact, and everything else that's going on in the world is fiction. It's kind of odd. So control the press. He's really been determined to make Russia a world power again, which I think he's kind of succeeded at. Russia was retracting in power when he took over. Now they're pressing out into the Syrian civil war and playing a major hand there, and they're reestablishing their influence into Eastern Europe, and they've invaded Ukraine even. So they're rebuilding the empire, the Soviet empire, slowly, not by conquest, maybe. But again, this makes Russians very proud that they're getting their place in the world and their place in history back. And by the way, you don't got to believe my hype. Don't believe anybody's hype. Some Russians actually might be really tired of him. They're too scared to say anything. You might wake up with the icy hand of Putin on your shoulder. But some folks may be tired of him or too intimidated to say anything anymore. But he is still wildly popular. Even polls that are from other places, they're like, well, we're not in Russia, and we don't have to say what the state wants us to say, but we polled Russians, and yep, they love him. Even if it's an overestimate of his popularity, you got to give it 60 or 70%. You got to give it 50 or 60%. Even if it's wildly overinflated, it's 50%, and it's probably not that wildly overinflated. So again, he has the power to do a lot, and a lot of whatever he wants to do to reestablish Russia in the world as he sees fit. Since he's been in office, not just all that other stuff I've talked about, but more militarily and politically, he's had a successful war against the Chechens. Russia's fought a couple of different wars against Chechnya, which is a province within their own territory, but it's ethnically Chechen people who are Islamic and perhaps don't want to be Russian. Once he got into power, he's crushed them with an iron hand, so he's really put his domestic house in order. There's not a lot of uprisings or protests happening in Russia anymore, for the obvious reasons. He successfully invaded Georgia. I say he, Russia successfully invaded Georgia in 2008 and helped two little provinces of Georgia, South Ossetia, and Abkhazia kind of get de facto independence, and Russia recognized them as sovereign states. No one else does, but Russia does. They hosted the Winter Olympics right after that. They successfully, covertly invaded eastern Ukraine in 2014. You've probably heard something about that. They successfully seized the Crimean Peninsula from Ukraine in 2014, solidified in 2015. So again, this is kind of old school. This is really 19th, 20th century behavior of, well, we don't care about the rules. We're Russia. We're going to start doing things like we used to. We're just going to go take stuff over. And who's going to mess? Who's going to step up and challenge us? And the answer so far has been, not many. So rebuilding the military has been a big push of Putin's in the last decade. Increased militarization of Russia's borders and beyond. And by that I mean now they're doing regular patrols, Navy and submarine and aircraft patrols in the Black Sea, which Russia hopes to make basically into a Russian lake, in the Baltic Sea up north. And Russia is doing all sorts of military exercises up there intentionally to challenge NATO, because the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania are NATO members, and so Russia's pushing back and saying, oh, you're going to do some NATO stuff up here in these countries? We're going to do some Russian military stuff in these countries. So Black Sea, Baltic Sea, and the Arctic Sea. Russia under Putin has claimed half of the Arctic Sea, and they have submarines and naval vessels and aircraft doing regular patrols up there. They've even reestablished some of their old Cold War security patrols that haven't been happening for 20 years. They're like, well, we don't really trust NATO and trust the United States at all, so we're going to pretend like the Cold War's back on and behave accordingly in a security military fashion. So increased control of the press. By the way, also repression of political opposition. There really is no political opposition in Russia anymore. There's no other party. Demonizing of the West under Putin. Russia has been taught that the cause of all of the evils and all of the ills of their society are all because of the United States, all because of NATO, all because of the Europeans. All of it. Anything that's wrong in Russian society, it's not Russia, it's those guys. They're trying to put us down again. They're trying to keep us under their boot heel. All of these things, including invading foreign countries, has really fired up this idea of national pride, and all combined have reverted Russia back to a one-party state. There, I said it. I have not said it openly yet, but I'm going to put it in the textbook as well. Russia is a one-party state. Some call Putin a dictator. Perhaps he is. but I don't want to go quite that far. That seems like a bit too much of name calling, because he was elected by the people, and if he held election tomorrow, he will be overwhelmingly re-elected by the people. So they still call themselves a democracy, but make no bones about it, there's only one political party. I mean, they keep a few other small ones around just for looks, but those political parties have no chance of winning anything. I think it's called, what is it, Russia Today? I think that's the name of the main political party in Russia, Putin's party. And there is no other option. That's a one-party state. Even if they have votes, even if they hold an election, there's only one party. It's a one-party state. So really moving Russia further and further to the right on a political spectrum. Speaking of which, there's one last leader that's done kind of the same thing. And the last leader of Eurasian persuasion that I want you to know, since he straddles two different regions between Europe and the Middle East, is the Turkish Titan. And that is President Recep Erdogan. Recep Tayyip, I love his name, Recep Tayyip Erdogan. Looks like Erdogan, pronounced Erdogan. He was the Prime Minister of Turkey. He is now the President of Turkey. And here's a few things to consider about Turkey before we get to the man himself. Turkey is a huge U.S. ally. At least it has been for a long time, since World War II. Turkey has been a NATO member for a very long time, since just after World War II. Turkey has been kind of a part of Team West pretty much since World War II. So things are changing fast in Turkey, but that has been the historic role that Turkey played, and the leaders of Turkey have historically backed this more pro-Western, pro-US, pro-NATO stance. I'm telling you this because obviously maybe it's changing right this second. Here's the other fun thing about Turkey. Even though it has all these connections with the West, they're a fully Islamic state, overwhelmingly Islamic in religion. Recep Erdogan himself is a center-right conservative, a religious fellow, okay, which has caused some tension within Turkey, since Turkey has fought very hard and prides itself on being a very secular liberal democracy, despite its almost 100% Islamic population. They, from a distance, and I've said this about Turkey before, they really are the most successful Islamic democracy on planet Earth. Again, it's starting to look like it's in a little bit of trouble in today's world, but historically that's what they've been. Why is that? Partly because of President Recep Erdogan. He seems to be dissolving the hard line between the secular state and the promotion of religion as being a much more integral part of life and perhaps even of governance in Turkey. And that's got a lot of people scared. I've known people ever since this guy's been in power a decade or longer that have said he's from a religious political party. He's trying to make Turkey into a religious state. And I've said for a decade, nah, this guy's pretty liberal. He's pro-democracy. He just happens to be of a political party, and it's called the AK party, by the way. The AKP, or the AK party, is kind of a religious party. It's called the Truth and Justice Party, something like that, something and justice. And they are openly kind of, yeah, we are conservative, and we like our religion. And by the way, if anybody thinks that sounds crazy, what are the Republicans in the United States? Aren't they kind of conservative and pro-religion, pro-Christian religion, but of similar status, I would say. The AK is like, yes, we're conservative, but we're very religious, and we think that religion should be more of a part of life. Again, think of Republican Party candidates who might say, yes, we should have prayer in school again like we used to. The AK party in Turkey would say, yes, we think the same thing. So it's not that they're wildly religious trying to turn Turkey into a theocracy, but they have been pulling it in that direction ever since Erdogan has been in charge. He was the prime minister of Turkey from 2003 to 2014, okay? So he's been in office for 13 years now he's been in power. Then he got elected as president in 2014. We already talked about this stuff, though. The prime minister versus the president. Turkey's supposed to be a place where the prime minister is the person actually in charge, which Recep Erdogan was from 2003 to 2014. But then he's been changing the rules and changing the Turkish constitution to give more power to the presidential office. It's supposed to, even right now in 2016, it's supposed to be that the president is the ceremonial position and the prime minister is the top slot, but that's not reality. So Recep Erdogan is President Erdogan, even though that's supposed to be ceremonial. Nope, it's not. It's really the top slot. He is large and in charge and in power in Turkey and has been since 2003. Okay? He has slowly and is still working to manipulate the Constitution and change it so that the president, so that it becomes more of a presidential system like the United States and perhaps other places. It's not supposed to be there yet, but it's going to be. Now, why would he want to do that? Because he's wildly popular too, much the way that Vladimir Putin is in Russia. Not that popular, but he's got 55, 60, 65% approval ratings. And he has been elected to office as the president, and he was a very popular prime minister. And while he was prime minister for that decade, Turkey really went places. Turkey's economy did really well. While European countries were kind of stagnating, Turkey kind of was doing good, diversifying its economy, and had decent growth rates for a whole decade. He was seen as being a very strong and proud religious person who was overseeing a successful economy. So it's kind of like, whoa, the magic formula. He was kind of everything to everybody, and he did pretty good the first almost decade. But now, again, kind of like Putin, things seem to be changing very quickly. Not only is he manipulating the Constitution so that it seems like he can stay in power indefinitely, or at least for a long time longer, people started to protest against his moves to do this back in 2013. There was a lot of unrest in Turkey because Turkey's, again, it's a secular state, and there's a lot of people in Turkey who are very pro-West, who want Turkey to join the EU, who want to have nightclubs and bars in the capital of Ankara, which there are. And again, slowly, this conservative guy and his religious party have been intruding on some of those rights and pulling more power to themselves. And so the kind of more pro-Western Turks really started to get unhappy about this. And uprisings occurred, which were kind of put down with brute force by the Turkish military under Erdogan's suggestion/orders. On again, off again protest about multiple things, including some economic troubles they ran into in 2013, 2014. But the bigger story is also that this absorption of power, also kind of limiting the press, also intimidating political opposition, has increased in Turkey. And that on top of protest about it, on top of repressing the protest. And now we pull up to 2016. You've had multiple terrorist attacks happen in Turkey. Terrorist attacks from both Kurdish groups. Oh, have we talked about them at all? There are a lot of Kurdish people in Turkey who perhaps want their own state. There are a lot of Kurdish people in northern Iraq who perhaps could have their own state. There are a lot of Kurdish people in Syria who are fighting against ISIS. That's where it comes back in. So you have terrorist attacks happening in Turkey. Some of them are claimed by pro-Kurdish groups. Some of them happening increasingly by this ISIS group. ISIS, of course, is this crazy whack clown posse that's been taking over parts of Iraq and Syria right south of Turkey. And Turkey has kind of been standing by watching this unfold, not wanting to get too involved because Turkey's Recep Erdogan actually hates the president of Syria, Bashar al-Assad, and kind of wanted ISIS or other groups to take him out. But also now the Kurds are part of the attacks in Syria. So now Turkey's getting involved in Syria because ISIS and the Kurds are attacking Turkey. I know. It's starting to be too complicated when I'm just talking about this dude. But here's why I'm telling you all this. Everything that's happening bad to Turkey right now is actually empowering Recep Erdogan as a leader. So every time a terrorist attack happens, people get a little more worried, a little more scared, and say, oh, give the president more powers to stop this. And the stronger ISIS has gotten. Everybody said, oh, let the president deal with ISIS any way he wants to. Give him more power. And right now, just in the summer of 2016, Turkey's finally stepped up and now is kind of invading Syria. Invasion sounds like the wrong word, but sending in tanks and warplanes and bombing stuff. bombing both ISIS folks, but also bombing Turkish folks. Not Turkish folks, bombing Kurdish folks, which is complicated because the Kurds are fighting against ISIS. It's such a mess. But all of these things have also empowered Erdogan because the Syrian crisis and the ISIS crisis have resulted in hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Syrians leaving Syria to try to get to Europe. Hey, I talked about that already. And a lot of them go through Turkey to try to get to Europe. And the European Union right now, in a state of semi-crisis about the immigration issue, has begged Turkey to not let them do that. They've said, hey, Turkey will give you a bunch of money, we'll do all these things, help us out, control these guys. And so this also empowers Erdogan even more. And he's like, so you, the European Union, need me to do something. You need me to control immigration. The U.S. and its allies need me to fight against ISIS. That also allows me to fight against the Kurds. Everybody needs me to do this, and therefore everybody's going to have to ignore that I'm absorbing more and more power to my position and to myself. See how this all works? There even now, Recep Erdogan is warming his relations with Russia. That's odd. Why odd? Well, if you know history at all, the Turks and the Russians have historically hated each other, and they fought many wars against each other. They're not friends. And Recep seems to be cozying up to Vlad the man Putin. Why would that be? We could see a historic pivot happening. Perhaps Turkey is tired of being pro-Western because Erdogan himself does not appear to be in a mood to be pro-Western. So maybe they're going to be more pro-Eastern and be more pro-Russian. It's an early call for this, but I'm telling you this. I want you to understand the situation. Turkey has historically been a U.S. ally and a NATO member. And because of all of the mess that's happening and this particular president becoming more powerful, we could be seeing a change in direction of the country that would affect U.S. policy, Middle Eastern policy, Russian policy. It's kind of a big deal. And again, see if these words sound familiar. Since Recep Erdogan's been in power for 13 years, increased control of the press, shutting down the press that you don't like who says bad stuff about you, repression of political opposition, calling people of opposite political parties as labeling their activities as treason, a repression of Western influence, shutting down bars and art galleries because it's an Islamic state, so why should they be serving alcohol in these places, manipulating the Constitution to increase the powers of the president, using the terror attacks, as well as a 2016 attempted coup to fire up national pride so that everybody should support the president. Oh my gosh, all these terrible things are happening in Turkey. Terrorist attacks all over the place, people blowing themselves up. And there was an attempted military coup. It was a super lame one, and many people think it was fake. But an attempted coup to take this powerful person from power. Everybody rally around the president. Give him more power. Let him shut down more of the press. Let him go after enemies of the state more mercilessly. This is starting to combine together to make Turkey into a one-party state. Hey, that's more like Russia, and Russia is the place that Recep Tayyip Erdogan is starting to cozy up to. Wow, did I take that one full circle? Conveniently enough, much like Vladimir Putin, again, he has solid support. He'll be around for a while. He has the power within the Turkish parliament to get any legislation passed that he wants at this point. They have the power to repress political opposition and the press at this point. However, Turkish society is not as lopsided as Russian society. So if things get really crazy, you could see some pushback and perhaps mass protests from Turkish people. That remains to be seen. Again, he was elected to office and he did win by 55, 60, 65% of the vote. That might be high, 55 or 60% of the vote. So still a majority of people support his semi-religious AK party and support him as a person as he is empowering the position and himself in that position. So he's looked upon as a strong man of Turkey. I won't say dictator, a strong man that is making Turkey a player that has to assert his power for security reasons, both at home and abroad. And has leverage with the European Union now to perhaps force the European Union to let Turkey into the European Union. Otherwise, Turkey's not going to help them with the immigration issue. So he's also stood up to Israel in terms of the Palestinian situation and sent aid to Palestine in times past and had fractious relationships with Israel. He has stood up to the president of Syria right next door and said he should be thrown from office because he's a bad human being. He is looked upon as a really good guy in most of the Middle East. Most Middle Eastern societies look at Turkey and President Erdogan and say, hey, he's Islamic, he's powerful, he's proud, he's proudly religious, and he's in charge of a powerful military and a powerful country that has a decent economy that's doing well. Hey, that's a model that maybe some others of us should follow. Having said all these things about the Middle East, looking at Erdogan and Erdogan being involved in the affairs of Syria and other things in the Middle East, maybe we better wrap this up and shimmy on over to the Middle East and look at the leaders in charge of that region along with the rest of sub-Saharan Africa. That's next.